A bear knocked on their window for 8 hours. What he wanted left everyone in tears. On a crisp autumn night, the Parker cabin stood bathed in pale moonlight, nestled deep in the dense woods bordering Yellowstone National Park. Inside, the crackling of the fireplace filled the cozy living room, its flickering glow casting warm shadows across the rustic wooden walls. John Parker, a retired forest ranger, sat in his favorite armchair, glasses perched on his nose as he leafed through an old journal detailing wildlife in the area. Across from him, Emily, his wife of 30 years, knitted a scarf, her hands moving deftly, while a steaming mug of chamomile tea rested on the table beside her. The tranquility of the evening was something they both cherished, far removed from the bustle of city life. As the minutes slipped by, the muffled sounds of the forest outside became their steady companion, punctuated only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustling of leaves stirred by the wind. Then came the first knock, a deliberate, rhythmic tap against the cabin window. John froze, his fingers pausing mid-turn of the journal's page. Emily looked up from her knitting, her brow furrowed. "Did you hear that?" she asked softly, her voice edged with concern. John nodded, his gaze shifting toward the large window facing the dark expanse of the woods. Another knock followed, louder this time, the sound reverberating through the cabin like the slow beating of a drum. Emily's knitting slipped to her lap as her grip on the needles tightened. "It's probably just the wind," John said, though his voice lacked conviction. Setting the journal aside, he stood, the creak of the floorboards breaking the tense silence. He reached for the flashlight on the shelf near the door, his movements deliberate yet wary. Emily watched him closely, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Be careful," she urged. John nodded, approaching the window with caution, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the shadows of the room. Outside, the moon cast silvery light across the landscape, illuminating the skeletal branches of trees swaying in the wind. At first glance, nothing seemed out of place. Then came the knock again, closer, deliberate, and unmistakably intentional. John's heartbeat quickened as he scanned the area just beyond the glass. His breath caught when the flashlight beam landed on a massive figure. A black bear stood just a few feet from the cabin, its immense frame partially illuminated by the light. Its glossy fur gleamed faintly, and its breath formed puffs of steam in the cold air. But what struck John most was the bear's behavior. It wasn't acting aggressively. Instead, it raised a paw, pressing it gently against the window. The bear's eyes, deep and intelligent, met his, and in that moment, John felt an inexplicable connection. Emily gasped softly, her hand covering her mouth as she rose from her chair. "John," she whispered, "what is it doing?" John didn't respond immediately. His focus remained on the bear, whose actions seemed almost calculated. He noticed then the glint of metal around the bear's front leg, the source of its distress becoming painfully clear. A wire snare had embedded itself deeply into the bear's flesh, the wound raw and oozing. The bear shifted its weight, letting out a low, mournful sound that made Emily's chest tighten. "It's injured," John said finally, his voice heavy with concern. He turned off the flashlight and stepped back from the window, giving the bear space. Emily approached cautiously, peering over her husband's shoulder. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. The bear's rhythmic tapping on the glass continued, softer now, almost pleading. It wasn't the frenzied aggression of a wild animal. It was something else entirely, a desperate attempt to communicate. John ran a hand through his graying hair, his mind racing. His years as a ranger had taught him to respect the unpredictable nature of wildlife, but this encounter was unlike anything he had ever experienced. "It must have been caught in a trap," he said. "The wire's cutting into its leg. If we don't do something, that wound could get infected. It won't survive." Emily's face paled. "But it's a bear, John," she said, her voice a mixture of fear and urgency. "What if it lashes out? What if it hurts us?" John placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, though his own apprehension was evident in his eyes. "I don't think it will," he said quietly. "It came to us. It's asking for help." Emily hesitated, her gaze shifting back to the bear, whose eyes never left the window. There was something hauntingly human in its expression, a vulnerability that made her heart ache. She took a deep breath and nodded. "Okay," she said, her voice steadying, "but we need to be careful." The couple moved into action, their instincts kicking in. John retrieved his old ranger kit from the closet, filled with medical supplies, antiseptic, and a pair of sturdy bolt cutters. Emily grabbed a large mixing bowl from the kitchen and filled it with honey, hoping the sweet treat would keep the bear calm while they worked. When they returned to the living room, the bear had stepped back from the window but remained close, its injured leg trembling visibly. John slowly opened the door, the cold night air rushing in and making him shiver. The bear tensed at the sound but didn't move away. It stood motionless, watching them with unblinking eyes. "Easy, big guy," John murmured, his voice low and soothing. Emily stayed behind him, clutching the bowl of honey. She placed it carefully on the ground a few feet from the door, retreating quickly. The bear sniffed the air, its massive head lowering to inspect the offering. It licked the honey tentatively before turning its gaze back to John. Taking the opportunity, John approached slowly, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. The bear let out a soft rumble but didn't move. Emily held her breath as John knelt beside the bear, examining the snare up close. The wire had cut deeply into the flesh, and the fur around the wound was matted with blood. "This is going to hurt," John whispered, gripping the bolt cutters. The bear flinched as he worked, its low growls vibrating through the air. Emily watched anxiously, her hands clasped tightly. The minutes felt like hours, but finally, with a metallic snap, the wire came free. The bear roared in pain, staggering back a step, but it didn't flee. John quickly applied antiseptic to the wound, his hands trembling. The bear let out a deep huff, its muscles relaxing slightly as the immediate pain subsided. It looked at John one last time before retreating a few steps, its gaze lingering. As the bear turned and lumbered back toward the forest, Emily exhaled deeply, tears streaming down her face. John watched until the dark figure disappeared among the trees. "Do you think it'll be okay?" Emily asked, her voice breaking. John nodded, though uncertainty lingered in his eyes. "We did what we could," he said. "The rest is up to it." That night, as they sat in silence by the fire, neither could shake the memory of the bear's gaze, an unspoken bond that had left them forever changed. The morning sun broke through the dense canopy of trees, casting pale streaks of light onto the forest floor. Inside the Parker cabin, the warmth of the previous night's fire lingered faintly, though the room had grown cooler with the early dawn. John stirred in his armchair, the events of the night still vivid in his mind. Emily, seated across from him, with a blanket draped over her shoulders, held a cup of coffee in her hands. She had barely slept, her thoughts consumed by the image of the injured bear and its desperate plea for help. The cabin was quiet except for the occasional crack of the logs settling in the hearth. John finally broke the silence, his voice low and thoughtful. "We need to check the trail." Emily looked up from her coffee, her brow furrowed in concern. "You think it's still nearby?" she asked. John nodded, rising from his chair and stretching his stiff limbs. "It's hurt. It might not have gone far. If it's in worse shape than we thought, we need to know." His words hung heavy in the air, and Emily could feel the weight of his determination. She placed her mug on the table and stood, wrapping the blanket tighter around herself. "I'll come with you," she said, though a flicker of apprehension crossed her face. John retrieved his old ranger gear, a sturdy pair of boots, a heavy coat, and a well-worn backpack containing first aid supplies. He handed Emily a flashlight and a whistle, his expression serious. "Stay close to me," he instructed. "If anything feels off, we turn back. No risks." Emily nodded, appreciating his cautious nature, even as her heart raced with a mixture of fear and resolve. Together they stepped outside into the crisp morning air, their boots crunching against the frosted ground. The forest was eerily silent, as though holding its breath. The trees stood tall and imposing, their branches reaching toward the pale sky. John scanned the ground carefully, his trained eyes searching for any signs of the bear's passage. It didn't take long to find them, deep paw prints pressed into the soft earth, accompanied by faint smudges of blood. "This way," John said, gesturing for Emily to follow. She gripped the flashlight tightly, her eyes darting between the tracks in the surrounding woods. As they ventured deeper, the forest seemed to close in around them, the shadows growing longer despite the rising sun. The trail led them along a narrow stream, its icy waters trickling quietly over smooth stones. John stopped suddenly, holding up a hand to signal Emily. She froze, her breath catching in her throat as she followed his gaze. Just ahead, partially obscured by a thicket of bushes, the bear lay resting near the water's edge. Its massive frame rose and fell with labored breaths, its injured legs stretched out awkwardly. The wound was still raw, the fur around it stained dark with blood, but it appeared to have stopped actively bleeding. John took a cautious step forward, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. The bear's ears twitched at the sound, and its head lifted slightly, its dark eyes meeting his. For a moment, neither moved, the tension between them palpable. "It's okay, big guy," John murmured, his voice calm and steady. "We're just here to check on you." Emily stayed a few paces behind, her heart pounding as she watched the silent interaction. The bear huffed softly, its gaze flickering between John and the stream. It didn't seem aggressive, but its body language was wary, its muscles tensed as though ready to retreat if needed. John knelt slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements, and reached into his backpack. He pulled out a small container of antiseptic and a clean cloth. "I'm just going to help," he said quietly, though he wasn't sure if the bear understood. Emily held her breath as John edged closer, the cloth in one hand and the antiseptic in the other. The bear let out a low rumble, its eyes narrowing, but it didn't move away. Gently, John dabbed the cloth against the wound, cleaning away the dried blood and debris. The bear flinched at the initial contact, a deep growl rumbling from its chest, but it didn't lash out. John spoke softly as he worked, his voice a steady rhythm meant to soothe both the bear and his own nerves. "You're a tough one," he said, glancing up briefly to meet the animal's gaze. "This'll sting a bit, but you'll feel better after." Emily watched in awe, her fear gradually giving way to a deep sense of wonder. The bear's trust, though tentative, was undeniable. It was as if some unspoken understanding had passed between it and John, a fragile bond forged in the darkness of the previous night. When John finished cleaning the wound, he sat back on his heels, his hands trembling slightly from the adrenaline. The bear huffed again, its muscles relaxing incrementally as it lowered its head to drink from the stream. "I think it's okay," John said, his voice filled with quiet relief. Emily stepped closer, her movements cautious but curious. The bear glanced at her briefly, its ears flicking, but it didn't react beyond that. Emily felt a pang of emotion as she took in the sight of the massive creature, its strength tempered by vulnerability. "I can't believe it lets you do that," she said softly. John nodded, his gaze fixed on the bear. "It knows we're not here to hurt it," he said. "Sometimes animals understand more than we give them credit for." After a few minutes, the couple began to back away, giving the bear space to rest. It watched them go, its eyes following their movements until they disappeared into the trees. As they retraced their steps toward the cabin, Emily couldn't help but marvel at the encounter. "Do you think it'll be okay?" she asked, her voice tinged with hope. John hesitated, his expression thoughtful. "It's got a chance now," he said. "That's more than it had before." Back at the cabin, the weight of the morning's events settled over them. Emily busied herself making breakfast, her hands trembling slightly as she cracked eggs into a pan. John sat at the table, staring out the window at the forest beyond. The tracks they had followed earlier were already fading, the frost melting under the soft glow of the sun. As they ate in silence, a sense of calm began to replace the tension. Emily reached across the table, her fingers brushing against John's. "I'm proud of you," she said quietly. "What you did out there, it was incredible." John looked at her, his expression softening. "We did it together," he said. "That bear trusted us. That means something." For the rest of the day, they remained vigilant, watching the woods for any sign of the bear. As evening fell and the sky deepened into shades of orange and pink, Emily found herself reflecting on the experience. The fear she had felt the night before had been replaced by something deeper, a profound respect for the creature that had sought their help. As the first stars appeared in the sky, Emily and John sat by the fire once more, their hands clasped tightly together. They didn't need to speak. The silence between them was filled with understanding. Somewhere in the forest, the bear was healing, and the thought brought them a quiet sense of peace. The following days passed in a strange rhythm of anticipation and quiet reflection. John and Emily found themselves drawn repeatedly to the edge of the woods, scanning the tree line for any sign of the bear. Each trip was a mix of hope and apprehension, their footsteps crunching softly over frost-laden grass as they ventured just far enough to check for tracks, but never too far to risk losing sight of the cabin. The trail they had followed before had faded, the snow melting under the warming sunlight, leaving only faint impressions in the softened earth. It was as though the bear had vanished into the wilderness, leaving no trace but the vivid memory of its desperate plea. John spent most of his mornings tinkering with his tools in the shed, an old habit he turned to when his thoughts grew too heavy. Emily often found herself watching him through the kitchen window, her hands busy with a loaf of bread she kneaded with more force than usual. Though neither of them said it aloud, the silence in the cabin carried the weight of unspoken questions. Had the bear recovered? Had their efforts been enough? Or had it succumbed to its injuries in the solitude of the forest? On the fourth morning after their encounter, John stepped outside to gather firewood. The air was crisp and clean, the faint scent of pine mingling with the earthy aroma of damp soil. As he reached for a stack of logs, something caught his attention. A shadow moved at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the trees. John froze, his hand hovering midair, his breath caught in his chest. Slowly, the shadow took shape, a massive, familiar form emerging from the dense foliage. The bear stood there, its dark fur catching the golden rays of the early sun. "Emily!" John called, his voice urgent but tempered with excitement. He didn't take his eyes off the bear, watching as it stepped forward cautiously, its gait still uneven but steadier than before. Within moments, Emily was at his side, wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron. Her gasp was audible as she followed John's gaze. "It's back," she whispered, her voice tinged with awe. The bear stopped just short of the clearing, its massive paws sinking slightly into the damp ground. Its gaze locked onto John and Emily, an unspoken communication passing between them. The wound on its leg was healing, though still raw and tender. The bear shifted its weight, letting out a low, rumbling huff. Emily clutched John's arm, her heart racing as the bear moved closer, its steps slow and deliberate. John raised a hand in a calming gesture, his voice steady and soft. "It's okay, big guy. We're not going to hurt you." The bear paused, tilting its head slightly as though considering his words. It then took another step forward, its eyes scanning the area before settling on a small pile of chopped firewood nearby. John realized it wasn't approaching them. It was simply looking for a safe space to rest. With deliberate care, John and Emily stepped back, giving the bear room to settle. It lowered itself onto the ground near the woodpile, its movements slow but less labored than before. Emily couldn't help but notice the bear's eyes, calm, watchful, and intelligent, as though it understood far more than she had ever given wildlife credit for. "It remembers," she murmured, more to herself than to John. "It knows we helped." John nodded, his gaze never leaving the bear. "Animals don't forget kindness," he said, "especially not when their survival depends on it." He turned to Emily, his expression thoughtful. "We should bring it some water, maybe something to eat. It looks like it's still recovering." Emily hesitated, her instinctive caution surfacing. "Are you sure? What if it takes it the wrong way?" John placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll be careful," he said, "but I think it trusts us." They worked in quiet tandem, John filling a large bowl with water while Emily prepared a small plate of food, leftover roast chicken and some apples from their pantry. Carrying the offerings, they approached the bear slowly, stopping a safe distance away before placing the items on the ground. The bear watched their movements intently, its ears flicking back and forth as it sniffed the air. John and Emily stepped back, giving the bear space to investigate. It lifted its massive head, nostrils flaring as it caught the scent of the food. With a cautious huff, it leaned forward, its broad tongue lapping at the water before nudging the chicken and apples. It ate slowly, its movements deliberate and unhurried. Emily felt a surge of emotion as she watched the bear. Gratitude, wonder, and an unshakable sense of connection. For the next hour, they observed the bear from a distance, marveling at its resilience. When it had finished eating, it stood and stretched, its wounded leg bending slightly as it tested its weight. It looked back at John and Emily one last time, a quiet acknowledgement in its gaze, before turning and lumbering back toward the forest. As the bear disappeared into the trees, Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "That was incredible," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. John nodded, his expression solemn. "It's not something you see every day," he agreed. Back inside the cabin, the couple sat at the kitchen table, the warmth of the encounter lingering like the fading glow of the morning sun. Emily reached for John's hand, her fingers curling around his. "I can't stop thinking about how it looked at us," she said. "It wasn't just an animal. There was something more in its eyes. Something human." John squeezed her hand gently, his gaze distant as he processed her words. "We're not as different from them as we like to think," he said after a moment. "They feel fear, pain, and gratitude just like we do. Sometimes I think they see us more clearly than we see them." The rest of the day passed quietly, but the encounter remained at the forefront of their minds. Emily found herself glancing out the window more often, hoping for another glimpse of the bear. John, though quieter about it, shared her sentiment. He spent the afternoon chopping firewood, his thoughts drifting back to the creature they had helped. That night, as they sat by the fire, the stars visible through the cabin's small window, Emily leaned her head on John's shoulder. "Do you think it'll come back?" she asked softly. John wrapped an arm around her, his voice steady. "If it needs us, it will," he said. "But I think it knows it can make it on its own now." Emily smiled faintly, her eyes closing as she let the warmth of the fire and John's presence lull her into calm. Somewhere in the depths of the forest, the bear roamed freely once more, its strength returning with each passing day. Though their paths might never cross again, John and Emily knew they had made a difference. A quiet, unspoken bond between human and animal that would stay with them forever. As winter deepened, the Parker cabin settled into its usual quiet routine. But the encounter with the bear had left an indelible mark on John and Emily. Every creak of the forest, every distant rustle of leaves carried a subtle promise that the bear might one day return. Though they tried not to dwell on it, both of them felt the absence keenly, a peculiar longing to see the massive creature they had come to regard as more than just a wild animal. Days turned to weeks, the frost thickening on the windows each morning, and still, there was no sign of their unexpected visitor. Life continued, but the forest seemed emptier somehow. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the world was bathed in a muted golden glow, John stepped outside to gather firewood. The air was crisp and silent, save for the soft crunch of his boots against the snow-covered ground. His breath curled into the cold air as he paused to survey the tree line. The bare branches swayed gently, casting long shadows that stretched toward the cabin. He had no reason to believe anything had changed, yet an inexplicable pull kept him standing there, his eyes scanning the edges of the woods. And then he saw it, a dark shape moving between the trees, its massive frame unmistakable even in the fading light. The bear emerged slowly, its fur shimmering faintly with frost, and for a moment, John felt his heart leap in recognition. But there was something different this time. The bear wasn't alone. Behind it, a smaller figure hesitated, then stepped into view. A cub, its fur thick and plush, its steps tentative as it followed its mother. John stood frozen, his chest tightening as the scene unfolded. The mother bear, stronger now, her wound nearly healed, paused at the edge of the clearing and turned her head toward John. Her deep, intelligent eyes met his, and he felt a rush of emotion, an overwhelming sense of connection that words could never capture. The cub nudged its mother's leg, curious but cautious, its wide eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. "Emily!" John called, his voice carrying a mix of excitement and wonder. Moments later, Emily appeared in the doorway, clutching her shawl tightly against the evening chill. "What is it?" she asked, her gaze following John's outstretched arm. When her eyes landed on the bear and its cub, her breath caught. "Oh my God," she whispered, stepping onto the porch. The bears didn't move, their bodies silhouetted against the soft glow of twilight. Emily's hand found John's, and they stood side by side, watching in silent awe. The mother bear took a step forward, her movements slow and deliberate. The cub followed hesitantly, its tiny paws leaving delicate imprints in the snow. They stopped a short distance from the cabin, close enough for John and Emily to see the healed scar on the mother bear's leg. For several long moments, the two couples, human and bear, stood in quiet communion. Emily felt tears prick her eyes as she took in the sight of the cub, its fur bristling in the cold but its posture unafraid. "She brought her baby," Emily murmured, her voice trembling with emotion. John nodded, his throat too tight to speak. The mother bear let out a low, rumbling huff, a sound that was neither aggressive nor fearful. It was a vocalization filled with intent, a kind of unspoken gratitude that resonated deeply with John and Emily. Slowly, the bear lowered her head, nuzzling her cub gently before turning her gaze back to the humans. Emily tightened her grip on John's hand. "Do you think she came to thank us?" she asked softly. John's voice was thick with emotion when he finally spoke. I think she trusts us enough to show us this." The cub, emboldened by its mother's calm demeanor, took a few tentative steps closer to the humans. It sniffed the air, its tiny nose twitching as it tried to make sense of the strange figures before it. Emily let out a soft laugh, a sound filled with wonder. "Look at it, John. It's beautiful." John crouched slightly, his movements careful and measured, as though trying to appear less imposing. The cub cocked its head, its round eyes studying him with innocent curiosity. Its mother let out another huff, a subtle reminder that the boundary between them remained, and John didn't dare push any closer. Instead, he stayed where he was, his gaze steady and filled with quiet reverence. As the last rays of sunlight faded and the first stars began to appear, the bears lingered a moment longer before the mother gave a gentle grunt. The cub turned reluctantly, casting one last glance at the humans before following its mother back toward the trees. John and Emily watched as their silhouettes melted into the shadows, their forms disappearing as silently as they had come. When the forest was still again, Emily wiped at her cheeks, a soft smile spreading across her face. "That was," she began, but words failed her. John nodded, his own expression a mixture of awe and contentment. "Yeah," he said simply, his voice low. Back inside the cabin, the fire crackled warmly, its glow casting long shadows across the walls. Emily poured 2 cups of tea, her hands trembling slightly from the lingering rush of emotion. She joined John by the window, where he stood gazing out at the darkened forest. "Do you think they'll come back again?" she asked, her voice filled with quiet hope. John sipped his tea, his gaze thoughtful. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe that was their way of saying goodbye." Emily leaned her head against his shoulder, letting the warmth of his presence and the memory of the evening wrap around her like a comforting blanket. "Either way," she said softly, "I'm glad we got to see them, to know they're okay." John placed a hand over hers, his touch steady and grounding. "We did our part," he said, "and she showed us that it mattered." That night, as they lay in bed listening to the distant calls of the forest, a profound sense of peace settled over them. The bear had come into their lives as an uninvited guest, a symbol of the wild's unpredictable beauty and fragility. But it had left as something more, a reminder of the quiet bonds that can form between species, the unspoken understanding that transcends language and fear. As sleep claimed them, John and Emily dreamed not of the mundane worries that had once filled their days, but of the forest and its inhabitants, of moonlit clearings and the soft crunch of snow underfoot. They dreamed of a mother bear and her cub, of trust and gratitude, and of the fragile, beautiful connection that exists in the space where 2 worlds meet. And in the heart of the wilderness, beneath a sky full of stars, the bears wandered on, carrying with them the faint echoes of a human kindness that would forever ripple through their lives.